Welcome to the show. You're listening to Green Hell, a Vietnam War podcast. Join me as I explore the history of the Vietnam War, remember the sacrifices and experiences of those who were there, and preserve those lessons learned and paid for through blood and unimaginable human suffering. Welcome back to the show, my Hellions. As of this recording, it is January 30th, 2025. I'm your host, Stephen Comstock, and today we're going to be talking about the Chinese Civil War and Mao Zedong. But first, I'm happy to announce that today I'm recording on some brand new equipment. I mentioned last episode, or maybe it was the episode before that I was upgraded to the Samsung Q9U microphone. Well, now in addition to that, I'm recording through an interface device called the Zoom PodTrack P4. Allows me to record in stereo, and I think there's going to be a noticeable quality difference. I was listening to the last two episodes, and it sounds a little better with the microphone, but there was still some issues that were just nagging at me. And what I realized is I needed to switch to an XLR cable. So not to nerd out on the technical specifics, but I think now I may have actually solved my audio quality issues. Or at least I'm taking a step in the right direction, which is all anybody can do. And like I said from the start, I'm only improving my fighting position from here on out. So you're with me for the ride. Thank you so much. By the time we get to the United States war in Vietnam, I think I'll have most everything ironed out. All right. And like I mentioned last time, you can reach me at my X handle at greenhell6969. You can also reach me on Facebook. Green Hell Podcast is the name of my Facebook page, or you can shoot me an email at 7thstanza@proton.me. That's 7thstanza@proton.mike.echo. So you're probably asking yourself, what the Steven? Why do I give a single about the Chinese Civil War or Mao Zedong? Isn't this a Vietnam War podcast? To which I answer, yes. Yes, it is. However, without Chinese communist blockade to the DRB, the French probably would have ultimately strangled them out and put an end to Ho Chi Minh's resistance. Plus, you also got to remember that the Chinese played a very pivotal role in the course that this whole tale was going to take, starting in 1945 when the Japanese capitulated and the British and Chinese split the country in half at the 16th parallel. The British and the Chinese did not have a unified front on how they were going to handle the whole question of decolonization or whether or not they were going to give the French back their territory. As you recall, the Chinese-controlled portion of Vietnam facilitated the rise of Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam and gave the Viet Minh an opportunity to really amp up the resistance movement, coordinate, consolidate, and prepare for fall-on activities against the French. In the South, the situation was different. The British handed over their portion of southern Vietnam back to the French. They released the French POWs and French administrative state that had been held captive by the Japanese, and they essentially gave the blessing for the French to engage in combat operations to crush the Viet Minh and retake the colonial territory that they had lost during World War II. All right, so I know you've heard all that, you know all that. I know it can be annoying to hear it repeated, but the more you're going to hear it, the more you're going to remember it, and all this is important to rehash for all the new listeners just tuning in, wondering what's going on. From December 1946 to January 1947, the French routed the Viet Minh from Hanoi. Ho Chi Minh and his entourage literally fled to the hills northwest of Hanoi. There they took refuge in a region called Viet Bac. This led the French to conduct a daring operation called Operation Leah. Although this operation was unsuccessful, it was notable because it was a 15,000 man operation that included riverborne, mechanized, and airborne operations in an attempt to crush Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh entourage before they had the chance to escape. They did escape due to a highly sophisticated intelligence apparatus that leaked the operation ahead of time. and Ho Chi Minh and his crew just barely escaped. However, the French did liberate some 200 hostages that had been taken with the Viet Minh as they retreated from Hanoi. The French suffered minimal casualties, and Western estimates put the Viet Minh casualty count at around 9,500, which supposedly included some 7,000 killed in action. So again, like I've said before, you can't always trust the casualty figures that are cited in these instances because both sides have clear incentives to lie. You might inflate the stats to present the perception that you're succeeding more than you really are, and you might deflate the stats for the purpose of making it seem like you're not getting your ass kicked as hard as you are. We know that the French were pushing out a lot of propaganda to try to convince the on the fence Vietnamese that it wasn't worth it for them to join the Viet Minh resistance efforts. So what better way than to make it seem like thousands and thousands of people are getting killed fighting against the French, right? And we also know that the Viet Minh would drag away and take off the battlefield their dead and wounded to avoid giving the French insight into the effectiveness of the French's combat operations. The Viet Minh were masters of the narrative. And kind of an underlying theme of all communist movements is this belief that if you can control the narrative and if you can control the perception of what is true, then you can succeed in executing your aims. And it checks out with communist philosophy because it's rooted in collectivism. And to get people to collectively behave in a certain way, you have to control the narrative. You have to control what they think. That's really the main issue that arises with communism. You've got a subset of the Communist Party controlling the narrative, controlling what people know, what people think, and what people do for the sake of collectivism. Don't question it. Trust the experts. They know best. They've got the public's interest in mind. They're going to make sure everybody's okay and everything's good. Sounds kind of familiar. But anyway, the government knows best. They're always right, and they never do anything up for the sake of their own power or agenda because they're definitely moral masters who are intellectually superior. And if only we could understand their grandmaster vision, then we would have a perfect utopia. But here's the thing. Anyone who's really studied Asian culture, you'll see that there is an underlying tendency towards conformity and collectivism that's kind of hard-rooted in their collective psychology. You know, that's that superego that I mentioned in the last episode. If you're really interested in learning more about the nuances in Asiatic culture, I highly recommend the book The Way of Zen by Alan Watts, one of the better known Westerners who studied Eastern culture. He was a big proponent of Zen Buddhism, but in general, he was definitely a master of explaining these foreign concepts. And it's really cool because there really are some profound psychological differences between Eastern societies and Western societies. And he does an excellent job of breaking it down for the Westerner. Another book that I would recommend is called World Religions by Huston Smith. It really dives into the nuances of all of the major Eastern religion, which is Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism. You don't have to agree with the precepts or tenets of a religion to understand that there's value in examining some of the underlying philosophical premises that all religions are rooted on in some form or fashion. For example, Buddhism has what's called its Four Noble Truths. And these Four Noble Truths are the core teachings of Buddhism. And they say basically that 1, life inherently involves suffering. 2, all suffering is caused by desire or craving. 3, suffering can only be overcome and eliminated by eliminating desire. And 4, the path to the end of suffering is the Eightfold Path. And then the Eightfold Path are these 8 guidelines of ethical and mental development that will allow someone to escape from the suffering of life. All right, so I'll let you mull this one over on your own, but I think it kind of bodes well for communist ideology. If you're not supposed to be desiring for things anyway, then as it so happens, the government depriving you of things for the sake of the so-called greater good. Yeah, all right, you're right. I guess I shouldn't be wanting for shit anyway. Also, another concept that bodes well for the adoption of communist ideology is that both Buddhism and communism are atheistic ideologies. They do not acknowledge a supreme God, a creator God, or an intelligent God that ordered the universe in any particular fashion for any particular cosmic goal. The implication being that if the superego of a group of people is operating under the baseline assumption that there is no higher authority or organizing principle in the universe beyond the natural order, then it's more cohesive with the communist principles that the state must do what religion cannot, and that is provide for the happiness and the well-being of the greatest number of people. All right, so real quick, we're going to segue into Confucianism, and this is just an important cultural nuance that I think we should just go ahead and discuss real quick since we're on the topic. Confucianism is an ethical slash philosophical belief system that was created by the Chinese philosopher Confucius. And I'm not going to go super deep into the details, but I just want to point out that there's a concept called the 5 constant relationships that are emphasized as the key human relationships in Confucius ethical thought. And those relationships are ruler to subject, father to son, husband to wife, elder brother to younger brother, and friend to friend. So think about that top one, right? Ruler to subject. And you've got thousands of years of belief that this hierarchy of ruler to subject, father to son, husband to wife, elder brother to younger brother, and friend to friend is a key pillar of your society. Just another interesting point, I think, that kind of bodes well for the Asiatic superego to embrace more easily communist collectivism. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the Chinese Civil War. All right, so we're going to start with thinking about the history of China in broad strokes. As we all know, it's an ancient civilization. It goes all the way back as ancient as the ancient Greeks, right? But the Chinese land wasn't imperial. It wasn't unified until the early 200 BCE timeframe. All right. The golden age of ancient Chinese thought was the Han Dynasty, which is 206 BCE to 220 CE. And that's when you had things like Confucianism being widely spread and adopted as the official state doctrine. And you had the Silk Road, which was a vital supply line and merchant corridor that connected China with the rest of the ancient world. And they went through their own kind of imperialism. They had their own ups and downs, some major technological advancements that they take credit for, like gunpowder and the compass. Then in the late 1200s through the mid 1300s, the Mongols conquered most of China and actually expanded out China's borders under Kublai Khan, right? Then you have what's called the late imperial period, and that consists of 2 main dynasties. The Ming Dynasty, that was from 1368 to 1644, known for the construction of the Forbidden City and some significant sea voyages. And then in 1644, you have the start of the Qing Dynasty, and that lasted from 1644 to 1912. It's the last imperial dynasty, and it faced its downfall via internal revolts and a lot of external pressure from Western powers. A lot of this pressure was pragmatically driven by economic reasons, right? Opium being one export that the people of Europe were very much craving at the time. But there was also kind of this interplay between spreading culture to the Chinese, that with the spread of Christianity to China, there came an event that's pretty significant. It's called the Taiping Rebellion. It occurred from 1850 to 1864, and it's one of the bloodiest civil wars in human history. The body count from that war is between 20 and 30 million due to combat, disease, famine, and atrocities committed by both sides. Okay, so just to add an edit, I looked up the correct pronunciation, and it's actually Qing Dynasty. It's spelled Qing, so I was mispronouncing the word, but it's Qing. Anyway, the Qing Dynasty is significantly weakened by the Taiping Rebellion. Okay, so what's the Taiping Rebellion? Well, the Taiping Rebellion was a uprising by a guy named Hong Xiaochuan, and this dude was heavily influenced by Christian missionaries, and he claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. He spun up a syncretic religious movement that combined Christianity with elements of Chinese folk religion, and he established a society that's called the Society of God Worshippers, which became the religious and ideological foundation of the rebellion. He preached against the corruption of the Qing dynasty and advocated for a new heavenly kingdom. Now, none of this has anything to do with Vietnam, but it's interesting to me because it's like, oh, interesting. So here we have a little known blip in history where a guy claiming to be a descendant of Jesus Christ and wishing to establish a utopia on Earth ends up leading to a violent clash that leaves 20 to 30 million dead. Not that dissimilar from communism in a lot of ways, if you think about it. And some of these concepts that his ideology advocated for may be a direct precursor to some of the communist ideologies that Mao Zedong advocates for, such as social reform. The Taiping aimed to overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish, quote, heavenly kingdom of great peace, which translates to the Taiping Tiangu. And some of their radical social changes included land redistribution. All land was to be equally distributed among the people. Sounds a little commie-ish, but this was before communism really spread. Gender equality. Women were given significant roles, including military ones, which was pretty revolutionary for the mid-1800s. And they also wished to abolish some antiquated practices, such as the foot binding of females, smoking of opium, and prostitution in general. The movement was deeply religious. It adhered to a very strict moral code and also embraced communal living. It was, by all accounts, a very puritanical, cult-like environment. So there you have it. Some precursors that very much resemble communism, land redistribution, equality, and communal living, for example. All right, so this whole show kicks off in 1851 when Mr. Hong declares himself the Heavenly King. The Taiping forces swept through southern China, capturing numerous cities, and their military success was largely due to their zeal, discipline, and the general disarray of the Qing forces, who didn't have the mental fortitude, I guess, or planning perhaps, or readiness to respond to this unexpected uprising. In 1853, Taiping forces captured the big city of Nanking, and they renamed it Tianjin, which is, the translation is heavenly capital, and it became the capital of their control. They enjoyed a few years of control, and then in 1856, there was an internal power struggle called the Tianjin Incident. And basically what you had was the leader of the Taiping was Hong Xiaochuan, but the Taiping government included key figures, and one of them claimed to be the conduit for divine messages from God, and another guy who commanded significant military power. So you had a power dynamic that was doomed to fail. I mean, what do you expect? You have one dude who's the brother of Jesus Christ, another dude who's a conduit for God, and another guy who actually controls military power. As you might imagine, one thing led to another. There was a power struggle, shocking, and it led to a situation where the guy who claimed to be a conduit for God demanded that he be elevated and given a title of Lord of 10,000 Years. This was obviously not boding well for Hong's claim to a supreme authority, and he felt pretty pissed. So he summoned some of his comrades, and they massacred Mr. Divine Conduit and killed all of his supporters, his family, and Chinese history cites the purge as resulting in 20 to 30,000 deaths. Yes, 20 to 30,000 deaths due to a political purge because a guy claimed to be the conduit of God and challenged the other guy who claimed to be Jesus Christ's little brother. You just can't make this stuff up. Mr. Jesus's brother, aka Hong, he was disturbed by the mass purge and the number of people killed, so he ends up having the military leader who executed that purge executed himself. Ultimately, this insane fiasco led to the drastic loss of cohesion amongst the Taiping military and political ranks and gave the Qing dynasty an opening to engage in a counteroffensive. Using military technology and strategies imported from Western civilization, the Qing dynasty was able to regroup, reconsolidate, reorganize, and conduct follow-on activities against the Taiping rebellious. European mercenaries played a crucial role in helping organize the Qing counteroffensive, and by 1864, the Taiping were defeated when the Qing dynasty recaptured Nanking and ended the movement. They completely crushed all the Taiping resistance and purged anybody that may have had any kind of favorability towards the Taiping. Thus, the 20 to 30 million body count, that includes those killed in battle, but those killed also in purge, and then those killed through disease and famine, which are natural byproducts of combat, especially in the mid 1800s. That's a doozy, everybody. That one was a doozy. I honestly had never heard of this conflict before, and it kind of blows my mind that 20 to 30 million people can be killed by a war started by a dude that claims that he's Jesus Christ's little brother. But here we are. That happened. And it's even crazier to me to think that that was in the mid 1800s, and only about 100 years later were the Chinese people going to face another upheaval that also led to the deaths of somewhere around 30 million or more people. It just boggles the mind. It proves that human beings are not likely to learn from their mistakes. But we live in times where we have AI, we have computers, we have knowledge, we have memory cards, people can read. Generally, people are smarter. So hopefully going forward, we can avoid these types of horrible events. But IDK, man, IDK. Jury's still out, I guess. Okay, so after all that upheaval and bloodshed, famine and death, the Qing dynasty went through a period where it was trying to modernize and basically recover from the chaos, right? And that lasted until the turn of the century. And at the turn of the century, there was another rebellion. It was called the Boxer Rebellion. It was an anti-foreign, anti-imperialist, and anti-Christian uprising that took place in China between 1899 and 1901. At this point in time, the Qing dynasty was in serious decline, weakened by military defeats, its internal rebellions, as well as the effects of European imperialism. Western influence essentially led to a situation where the Chinese signed unequal treaties that granted Western powers extraterritorial rights, control over seaports, economic concessions, and this led to widespread resentment against foreign influence. And the resentment was not unfounded. Economic hardship, including famine and unemployment, were exacerbated by Western foreign economic incursions, and a lot of people blamed the spread of Christianity by missionaries as a cultural threat that was further exemplifying, if nothing else, the overreach of foreign powers in China. And so a secret society, sound familiar, right? Remember World War I? A secret society known in English as the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, composed mainly of peasants, artisans, and former soldiers who practiced martial arts and a form of folk religion, believed that they could become invulnerable through rituals. Yes, I said invulnerable through rituals. They thought that they could make themselves impervious to Western technology through martial arts and Chinese folk magic. And so this group, the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, gained a belief that they could overcome Western influence and engage them in combat to restore traditional Chinese values and order. The Qing dynasty kind of considered them useful idiots and eventually threw them their support, hoping that maybe they could be effective in ousting the foreign influences. As a result, a dramatic event occurred from June to August 1900 in Beijing when this secret society, as well as elements of the Qing dynasty's army, sieged the foreign legations in Beijing, where it was a place where diplomats, missionaries, and Chinese Christians were congregating. In response, an international military coalition formed by Austria-Hungary, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Russia, and the United Kingdom, as well as the United States, intervened to rescue their foreign nationals and suppress the rebellion. The alliance forced a march from Tianjin to Beijing and lifted the siege of the legations and resulted in the capturing of Beijing in August 1900. The Qing dynasty, due to their part, was forced to sign the Boxer Protocol in 1901. This was a reparation that forced China to pay a massive indemnity to the foreign governments. Also, it forced the Chinese to accept foreign troops to occupy parts of China, and it demanded the execution or punishment of all officials who supported that secret society, aka the Boxers. And it's might seem like an unrelated event that has nothing to do with Vietnam, communism, anti-imperialism, but actually has a lot to do because what happened in the aftermath of this was a heightened anti-imperialist sentiment among the Chinese populace. This resulted in revolutionary movements that would ultimately overthrow the Qing dynasty in 1911. Once the last Qing dynasty emperor abdicated the throne, a new Republic of China was to take place in that power vacuum. But ultimately what happened was a period of chaos. From 1916 to 1928, China fragmented into territories that were controlled by various warlords. This era was characterized by constant warfare, economic instability, and social chaos. Amid the incredible chaos and fragmentation of China after the fall of the Qing dynasty, an event occurred on May 4th, 1919, called the May 4th Movement. So, some quick background. At the end of World War I, after Germany was defeated, there was the Treaty of Versailles, which, among other things, demanded that Germany give up territory. And part of that territory was what's called the Shandong Peninsula. Previously controlled by Germany, it was then transferred to Japan. The Chinese were really, really upset with this. And I can't say I blame them, being from a peninsula myself, Florida. I would be kind of pissed if foreign powers demanded that Florida be handed over to Cuba or Venezuela or Mexico or some other entity just because a country that used to control my state now lost, and some other countries said that my state had to go. As a result of this general political upheaval and turmoil, there was a lot of dissatisfaction amongst intellectuals and educated folk of the modern Chinese society who saw Confucian values as being outdated and a contributing factor to China's overall weakness in light of these foreign machinations, schemes, and plans. And so, on May 4th, 1919, thousands of students from Peking University and other schools in Beijing gathered to protest. They marched to the home of a government official seen as pro-Japanese, and they burned his house down. The movement quickly spread from Beijing to other cities like Shanghai, Tianjin, Nanking, and involved students, workers, and merchants. These protesters rejected the Treaty of Versailles. They demanded the dismissal of pro-Japanese officials in the Chinese government, and they declared the abolition of the 21 demands that Japan had imposed on China in 1915. They also declared national sovereignty, democracy, and science as the supreme ideals by which Chinese society should dedicate itself going forward. May 4th, 1919 is seen as the beginning of a new cultural movement that propelled science and democracy as ideals for the modernization of China, and also the rejection of classical modes of thought such as Confucianism. In the churn of this cultural upheaval, a subset of intellectuals, disillusioned with both traditionalism as well as exploitative Western capitalism, looked to communism for better solutions. As a result, 2 years later, you had the formal establishment of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921. Many of its founding members were influenced heavily by the May 4th ideals. As well as the Communist Party being established in 1921, you had a revitalization of a general sense of nationalism. A group that was very much a proponent of nationalism at the time was the Kuomintang. Chinese society was rejecting what was going on around them, declaring that things needed to change and that you had two competing philosophies. One was communist and one was nationalist, but both were spurred on by a sense of reunifying China. The Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party, who I will hereto refer to as the KMT and CCP, respectively, initially formed an alliance and presented a unified front from 1923 to 1927 with the backing of the Soviet Union to help consolidate a Chinese government against the warlord control. This resulted in an event called the Northern Expedition. From 1926 to 1928, a KMT-led military campaign was initiated to unify China under their control. Initially, the communists participated, kind of like how the DRV initially had other anti-colonial support under their wing, but ultimately, as you can imagine, there came a power struggle along ideological lines after they succeeded in overthrowing several of the prominent warlords. When the founder of the KMT, Sun Yat-sen, died in 1925, he was succeeded by Chiang Kai-shek. More or less around the same time, rising star in the CCP was none other than Mr. Mao Zedong. The KMT nationalist had more urban support, while the CCP began building a base in rural areas amongst the peasants. Okay, now, so keep in mind that this was about 5 years after the Red Terror occurred in Russia, where the Bolsheviks overthrew the government and purged any dissent and installed a new communist government in Russia. With the Bolsheviks' Red Terror fresh in everybody's mind, a lot of international anti-communist sentiment was rooted in a fear that the same thing that happened in Russia could happen elsewhere. The uneasy alliance between the KMT and the CCP started to deteriorate significantly in the spring of 1927. In late March 1927, communists and workers in Shanghai staged an uprising to liberate parts of the city that were under warlord control, as Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist troops were nearing to do the same. Fearing the communist political and military strength, Chiang Kai-shek decided to eliminate them to prevent a potential communist takeover of the KMT. On the morning of April 12th, Chiang Kai-shek ordered the purge of communists in Shanghai. KMT troops, police, and local gangs began arresting, torturing, and executing suspected communists and labor leaders, resulting in thousands of KMT political opponents being tortured and executed. This event in Shanghai resulted in the remaining CCP forces fleeing or hiding, and then in August 1927, some CCP and left-wing KMT members organized an armed uprising in Jiangxi province. Chiang Kai-shek's KMT quickly suppressed this event and continued to pursue the complete annihilation of the CCP. About this time, interstage left Mao Zedong emerges as a key leader for his advocacy of abandoning organizing of workers in urban areas. They realized that the KMT had too much control of the urban population centers, and therefore they decided to rely on the peasant forces in the rural zones as the core base of their resistance. Thus, Mao Zedong began organizing the peasants in the Hunan province to establish what's called a peasant soviet, aka a peasant council. These councils were peasants that agreed with communist philosophy and wanted to challenge local landlords and the KMT nationalist forces in Hunan to expand control and establish a base for further revolutionary activities. A large part of their motivation was land reform, also known as stealing from the landlords and giving land to the poor, a reoccurring theme that we'll see significantly shapes the DRV's efforts to mobilize its base. As we're going to soon see, Chinese communists didn't just help Ho Chi Minh's DRV with military and material aid, but also with political and policy decisions, closely linked to their personal experience fighting Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces. Okay, so initially Mao Zedong has around 5,000 troops. This includes workers, peasants, and some defected KMT soldiers. They aimed to capture key towns, redistribute land to peasants, and established a more cohesive revolutionary base to operate from. They captured several key towns and established a temporary government. However, lack of sufficient coordination, military experience, and underestimating the local KMT forces led to quick counterattacks, and eventually they were surrounded and defeated by the KMT. This pushed the CCP further away from the urban areas, not just in the outlying rural zones, but deep into the mountains where they were far, far from the KMT urban control center. Despite the initial military failure of the CCP, this retreat to the rural zones and his emphasis on land reform helped him gain significant traction with the peasants and thereby elevating his position in the CCP leadership structure. Mao Zedong began to implement and refine his guerrilla warfare tactics, which would become the model by which the DRV and Viet Minh copied to fight against the French. Between 1930 and 1933, there's what's called the First to Fourth Encirclement campaigns. During this time, Chiang Kai-shek launched several campaigns to destroy the communist bases. The CCP, under Mao's leadership, continued to use guerrilla warfare to counter these attacks, often successfully repelling KMT forces. However, there was an ongoing power struggle within the CCP between those who followed Moscow's directives, called the 28 Bolsheviks faction, and those who supported Mao's rural strategy. The main point of contention between these two factions within the CCP was whether or not to focus on urban uprisings or rural uprisings. Mao Zedong obviously advocated for mobilizing the peasants in the rural areas to execute guerrilla warfare, whereas the 28 Bolsheviks relied heavily on using urban workers and labor unions to organize resistance. Ultimately, Mao Zedong's position carried the day when Chiang Kai-shek's Fifth Encirclement Campaign, 1933 to 1934, devastated the communists. With the help of German military experts, the KMT used blockhouses and encirclement to significantly reduce the CCP's control in Jiangxi province. Now, the reason this Fifth Encirclement campaign was successful was for two particular reasons. One, in the CCP, there was the internal struggle with the 28 Bolsheviks and Mao Zedong. The 28 Bolshevik were at their peak influence during this time and had shifted away from Mao's guerrilla tactics and towards more conventional warfare. Due to this shift towards conventional warfare, Chiang Kai-shek was able to combat the conventional warfare with a system of fortified block houses, literally bunkers that were connected by trenches and encircled the communist-controlled areas. One note of interest here is that both the KMT and the CCP had German military advisors. This system of bunkers and trenches, literally encircling these communist-controlled areas, cut off supply lines and forced the communists into disadvantageous defensive positions. As a result, the CCP were taking heavy casualties, and ultimately they decided in October 1934 to abandon their Jiangxi Soviet and engage in what's called the Long March. Now, this event goes down in history, and especially communist China history, as an insane feat of endurance and strategic retreat, as well as a significant event that led to the rise of Mao Zedong. And here's why. So around 86,000 to around 100,000 CCP members, including soldiers, civilians, and all the core leadership, obviously, escaped from Jiangxi province. This retreat did not follow a single path, but involved multiple routes through all kinds of different terrain. Ultimately, this journey covered not 1,000, not 2,000, not 3,000, not 4,000, but 6,000 miles through mountains, rivers, and hostile territory. Yes, 6,000 miles. For some context, the Appalachian Trail is about 2,200 miles. At its widest point, the United States is estimated to be about 3,000 miles. And as you can imagine, such a long and treacherous journey resulted in insane casualties from disease, starvation, exhaustion, and combat as the KMT pursued them this entire time. Ultimately, it's estimated that only about 10% of the original travelers made it to their final destination. Now, as you can imagine, this is an epic tale, and I wish I knew more about it right now, but I don't. I need to read some firsthand accounts and some books about it, but it's mind-boggling. 6,000 miles being constantly pursued by KMT forces seeking to completely annihilate you. These people, they hiked up snow-covered mountains, they crossed deep, raging rivers while under fire, they quested across desolate grasslands. I mean, it was no joke, right? 6,000 miles. That's like walking from one end of the United States to the other and back under the worst conditions imaginable. And in the end, their tribulation allowed for the CCP to survive, reorganize. It led to Mao Zedong's elevation to the leader of the CCP and a shift permanently towards his strategies of guerrilla warfare and his efforts to mobilize the peasantry in rural areas using land reform as the primary hook. After settling down in Yan'an which is in Jiangxi province. The CCP eventually advocated for a second united front with the KMT against the Japanese invasion, which began in 1937. This temporarily halted their civil war. In a twist of fate that you just can't make up, the KMT and CCP fought together side by side against the Japanese for 8 long years. Now, as you might recall from one of the first episodes that I ever made, the Soviet Union had occupied Manchuria in 1945. After the Japanese surrendered, the Soviets allowed the CCP to take control of Japanese weapons and equipment, thereby significantly bolstering their military capabilities. And the KMT were facilitated by the United States with return to regions like Taiwan and parts of mainland China that they had previously controlled. The United States notably provided logistical support, which included airlifting KMT troops to strategic locations. From August 1945 to October 1945, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong met for peace talks mediated by U.S. General George Marshall. Ultimately, these negotiations failed due to fundamental disagreements. Shocking. By 1946, peace talks broke down completely. The KMT began attacking CCP-held areas, especially in Manchuria, and this led to the full-scale resumption of the Civil War. As you might imagine, the CCP launched guerrilla warfare and started to regain ground in rural areas, while the KMT attempted to consolidate control over urban centers and major transport routes. The KMT's governance was plagued by corruption, inflation, and economic mismanagement, which eroded its support, whereby the CCP's land reforms had helped gain control and won back more peasants. From 1945 to 1949, the CCP and the KMT went at it with intense fighting that ultimately saw the CCP expand control of its rural bases into urban areas. By 1948, campaigns had decisively turned the tide for the CCP, and they captured key cities and industrial areas, leading to the eventual collapse of Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces. Chiang Kai-shek's KMT forces retreated to Taiwan, where it established the Republic of China and continued to claim sovereignty over all of China. And that kind of explains the main beef between China and Taiwan that we're seeing today in 2025. Whew. All right, everybody. That was a long one, but I hope you see some of the parallels and gain a new appreciation for the context whereby the Chinese influenced the DRV and thus the entirety of the course of the Vietnam War. I'm going to do a special episode later on the Long March because I'm reading some brief anecdotes, and geez, that's a whole episode in itself, but that's insane to me. Just 6,000 miles under the worst conditions possible. That's crazy. I'm also going to do probably a special episode on Mao Zedong himself. It won't be very long, but that dude's a bit of a character, worth noting, I think. But alas, let me draw this episode to a conclusion. Thanks for tuning in. I just want to briefly mention that you can now get this podcast on Apple Podcasts as well as iHeartRadio. And as always, I want to give a special shout out to the folk over at www.zapsplat.com. And please shoot me a message if you have something to say or you want to ask a question. And also, I appreciate any reviews and like and subscribes. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Your support means a lot. I hope you learned something today. And until next time, be brave, be badass, be boisterous. Talk to you later.